Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, the Chief Executive here and also a proud member. A couple of weeks ago, we hosted the President of the United States. Today, we host a man who hopes to replace him. Former Internal Revenue Service Commissioner and Republican candidate for President, Mark Everson. You know, one of the things about politics is that even though you can run for and even win executive offices without executive experience, it's really hard to get the media to pay attention unless you're already a big name. So when Senator Ted Cruz was described in recent weeks as the first Republican to announce his candidacy for president, those of us working on this event chuckled a little, because Mark Everson announced his candidacy on March 5th of this year. Mr. Everson comes with executive experience. He's currently vice chairman of Alliant Group, a provider of specialty tax services for small and medium-sized businesses. But perhaps more importantly, he served as the 46th Commissioner of Internal Revenue, appointed by George W. Bush and serving from 2003 until 2007. Prior to his appointment as Commissioner of the IRS, Mr. Everson held a number of federal government positions in the Reagan and Bush 43 administrations, as well as at the state level within the administration of Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels. During his candidate announcement, Mr. Everson provided a detailed six-point plan for America that includes pushing for a new consumption tax to replace most of the income tax, restoring the military draft in order to foster a sense of shared sacrifices, tackling entitlement spending, and pledging to serve just a single term in the White House. Today, Mr. Everson will discuss the second point in his six-point plan, the lawlessness of large financial institutions. In a recent op-ed in the Plain Dealer, Mr. Everson detailed the transgressions of several major banks and called for a fresh look at the government's approach to criminal behavior by banks. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Mr. Mark Everson.
Thank you. Before I start, I want to clarify, I don't want to replace the president. I want to follow the president. I think I'm going to take enough heat during the debates and the run-up to the Republican contest. I don't need him as going after me either. So anyway, but thanks for having me. It's great to be back in Cleveland. I've addressed the City Club twice before. Speaking here for a third time, it may not be as great as hosting Saturday Night Live for a third time. But if you're a former IRS commissioner, this is probably as good as it gets. I'm here because I am running for President of the United States. I will devote a substantial portion of my remarks to a discussion of some of our largest financial institutions and my concern that they have come to undermine two cornerstones of our economy and really our democracy, American entrepreneurship and respect for the rule of law. But before turning to the subject of the big banks, I want to share with you some important points about my candidacy for president. Since I announced for the presidency on March 5th, many observers have asked two questions. First, of course, is what makes me want to do this, and why do I think I am qualified for the job? And second, given an expected field of over a dozen on the Republican side, how could a former IRS commissioner with almost no name recognition and without a list of wealthy donors think he has a chance? Over the last 2 years, I have spoken with Americans in 30 states across the country, from Connecticut to California, from Alabama to Arizona, from Ohio to Oklahoma. You get the idea. Wherever I have gone, it is pretty much the same story. Not all, but most of us are doing better than 5 or 6 years ago when the economy was such a mess. But at the same time, relatively few of us believe the country as a whole is doing better. Not just economically, but as a society, and in particular, as a democracy. Americans are skeptical about leaders at all levels of government. And for good reason. We do not believe our politicians are square with the people or willing to take on the tough issues. Instead, politicians from both parties offer painless solutions which benefit special interests and all too often advance causes backed by well-heeled donors. Many in each party act as though they genuinely believe they are just one election away from vanquishing the other side and setting the country straight. Our Constitution is strong, and Americans are resilient, but many millions of us are worried about our nation and quietly but increasingly anxious for leaders who are willing to make the difficult decisions required to secure our future. I am running for president because I believe more Americans than the media and politicians would have you believe are willing to entertain policy solutions from beyond their natural political perch, as long as those policies are well-reasoned and not based on narrow political interests. While I have extensive government experience at both the federal and state levels, most of my career has been in the private sector. I have run a factory on the south side of Chicago and worked in agriculture. I have lived and worked not just in the United States, but also in Turkey, France, and Zambia. I would note that some in the expected Republican field have limited, if any, experience at all in the private sector. My government service includes 6 years in the Reagan administration and 6 years under the second President Bush, as well as several years at state government working with Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels. My assignments have run the gamut, including sensitive public diplomacy projects undertaken to support deployment of intermediate nuclear forces in Europe and surrogate radio broadcasting to Cuba during the Cold War under Reagan, and management of the nation's immigration system as INS Deputy Commissioner, also in the Reagan administration. I have overseen OMB's management portfolio and served as our country's 46th Commissioner of Internal Revenue. The IRS was doing better then under President Bush. In Indiana, I ran the state's unemployment insurance system and oversaw workforce training and adult education programs. Each of these assignments, in line or staff positions, in the private sector or in government, in the United States or overseas, has taught me hard lessons. I have gained the perspective that only success and failure in multiple endeavors over a sustained period can bring. And while many of the presumed Republican candidates have records of significant achievement at the state level, my assignments in the executive branch of the federal government are significantly beyond those of the other likely candidates. Given the complexity of today's federal government, I believe a successful track record of leading significant agencies in the executive branch is a sound, even if untraditional, platform from which to seek the presidency. Most organizations work that way. They choose leaders who know the business. I have set forth a 6-point plan in my letter to America, which you can find in its entirety at markforamerica.com. Let me run through its most important elements. A cornerstone of an Everson presidency will be fundamental tax reform. Despite the efforts of congressional leaders like Paul Ryan at Ways and Means and Orrin Hatch at Finance and their counterparts on the other side of the aisle, I do not believe 86 Act type tax reform, that is, paring down or eliminating tax expenditures and lowering rates, is possible in today's political environment. We need to go bolder. I propose institution of a hybrid system, leaving the income tax in place for high earners, but taking 150 million Americans off the income tax rolls entirely and instituting a consumption tax. This approach will be revenue neutral and leave undisturbed the relative tax burdens of the wealthy, the middle class, and those who earn less. And it will lower personal income tax rates for high earners continuing to pay income tax, as well as drive down corporate rates for businesses. Our economy will prosper. A substantial majority of Americans will no longer need to worry about the annual exercise of filing a tax return. Just a reminder, under current law, all of you owe the government a return in 12 days. I will come back to point 2 regarding the banks in a few minutes. I believe in a robust but measured foreign policy. I will repair frayed relations with our allies and restore our damaged prestige abroad. And I will strengthen our military, particularly the Navy. I also think it is time to bring back the draft. I do not propose to end the volunteer component, but to fill a certain percentage of enlistments with draftees selected from the whole of our population. The wealthy and powerful should have skin in the game when we consider the deployment of American troops. While our all-volunteer force has been effective and our military is second to none, the cost has been too high. The burden of securing our freedom is being borne unevenly, and we have lost the American sense of shared sacrifice for the common good, which has served us so well in generations past. We also need to address our entitlement programs and make significant reforms before it is too late. I do not think we should increase income taxes on high-end earners any further, but do support means testing and other tightening for entitlement programs. If we do not take serious steps to rein in our spending, phasing in changes over time and leaving in place current benefit levels for those already or soon to be receiving payments, debt as a percentage of GDP will overwhelm us, and entitlement spending will squeeze out everything else, including our national defense. I favor comprehensive immigration reform, improving our legal immigration system, securing the border, strengthening interior enforcement through universal application of E-Verify, and yes, amnesty, providing a path to citizenship for qualifying illegals. I think that the President's post-election executive order deferring enforcement actions and providing work authorization and benefits for millions was unwise and wrong, but it does not mean we can afford to kick the immigration can down the road any longer. Let's face facts. The 11 million people here illegally are not going anywhere. And the cost of removing them, economic and societal, would be far too high. I advocate the path to citizenship because I want all of us pulling together in the same direction. We must reinforce the American tradition of assimilation, lest we follow Europe into incoherence, chaos, and grave division over how to confront radical Islam. Over 2 centuries of success building a nation of immigrants into a strong and cohesive democracy should not be abandoned in a fit of politically correct ideology. My last point concerns my view of the presidency itself and how I will govern if elected. I am a constitutional conservative. When I was at the IRS, I always felt I served the nation best and the president who appointed me if I executed the law as written, not as I might wish it to be. I followed the same approach years earlier at the INS, also an important and sensitive arm of our government. As president, I will do the same, understanding that while the powers of the presidency are significant, they are also limited. Further, I will serve only a single term in office and seek a constitutional amendment limiting future presidents to 1 5- or 6-year term. Americans deserve a full-time president who should not be spending endless hours in years 3 and 4 of his term out raising money and scrounging for votes. Let's keep the self-interest of re-election politics out of Oval Office decision-making. Let me turn now to the big banks. I have always felt that our entrepreneurial culture and respect for the rule of law have underpinned American success and been the envy of countries around the world. In recent decades, our economy has been in constant transition, adjusting to the impact of new technologies and increased competition through globalization. Things are not going to get any easier in the foreseeable future. Sadly, it is a legitimate question whether our largest financial institutions are adequately fostering growth in the economy, particularly for small and mid-sized businesses. One must ask if the sustained lawlessness of the big banks is undermining the rule of law. I will start with this second question. Let me say that I am not in favor of more regulation as a general proposition. In fact, we should look carefully to determine where we can cut back on regulations or sunset statutes altogether. That having been said, laws on the book should be respected and enforced. In recent years, a number of the world's largest financial firms have been on a law-breaking bender. Several of our largest banks have engaged in serial violations, selling shoddy mortgage-backed securities and attempting to fix benchmark interest rates and foreign currency exchange rates, to name but 3 of many problems. J.P. Morgan Chase has made payments aggregating $34 billion to resolve claims of wrongdoing. The company's board of directors looked the other way. Shortly after paying out $17 billion, CEO Jamie Dimon got a 50% pay raise. The story is much the same for Bank of America, for which the cost to clean up just one of its infractions was $10.3 billion. Just 2 weeks ago, Bank of New York Mellon agreed to a $714 million settlement for defrauding investors. I could go on, but I am sure you have all seen the headlines. Eric Holder's Justice Department has shaken down the big banks for large settlements. But the banks have plenty of cash. After all, they are, as bank robber Willie Sutton said, where the money is. Opting for deferred prosecutions, Holder has left alone the executives in charge. The result has been entirely predictable. The banks run the light, pay the ticket, and drive on. In my experience, the administration of justice functions most effectively and is fairest when the law and its application provide a range of sanctions for violations. During my tenure as IRS Commissioner, I was proud to serve on the President's Corporate Fraud Task Force. We held CEOs criminally accountable when warranted. With Dennis Kozlowski of Tyco, Ken Lay of Enron, Richard Scrushy of Health South, and Bernie Ebbers of WorldCom, each brought to justice and convicted. It is time to put criminal charges back into DOJ's toolkit. I remember when then Deputy Attorney General and now FBI Director Jim Comey and I were discussing certain joint DOJ-IRS investigations. And Jim said to me, the nice thing about white-collar criminals is they get it. You throw a few of them in jail and behaviors change. I would do something else to encourage the banks to follow the law. As it stands, these massive fines are not paid by the culpable parties. They are effectively charged to millions of small investors and pension funds. Congress should draw a line in the sand. When a corporation incurs a fine above a certain amount, say $500 million, but the number could be higher or lower, any compensation to the CEO in excess of $1 million should be taxed at an incremental rate of 95%. You would not think this should be necessary, but it seems that in order to get executives running the mega banks to follow the law, we need to punish transgressions by hitting them where they will actually take notice, in their wallets. Federal Reserve Chairwoman Janet Yellen has sounded the alarm, perhaps not known to be as direct as a presidential candidate. In a speech last month, she was still quite clear about the problem. Yellen stated that recent incidents, quote, both individually and in their totality, raise legitimate questions of whether there may be pervasive shortcomings in the values of large financial firms that might undermine their safety and soundness, close quote. The question to pose is not whether the big banks are too big to fail, but rather are they just too big? I would suggest that if certain financial institutions are too large and complex to be properly managed and follow the law, then we should break them up for the safety of the American economy. Beyond the problem of illegal acts by the mega banks, there is the equally, if not more important, issue of increased concentration in the banking sector. In a February article in the American Banker, Richard Parsons, former CEO of the Dime Savings Bank of New York and later of Time Warner, noted the disturbing decline in community banks across the nation. Citing FDIC reports, Parson points out that since June 2010, the number of banks with assets below $100 million has declined by 32%, and the number with assets between $100 million and $1 billion fallen by 11%. The share of U.S. assets held by banks with assets over $10 billion has been increasing, while the market share of smaller banks has been in relative free fall. Does it matter? It pretty clearly does. Observers are increasingly worried about the low number of new small businesses. Again, Janet Yellen. In remarks last October, she noted that, quote, business ownership is associated with higher levels of economic mobility, close quote, and expressed concern about the sharp decline in business creation. This is a complex subject. My old boss, Mitch Daniels, now the president at Purdue, thinks that a contributing factor is the explosion of student debt. Graduates are too saddled with loan repayments to chase their dream and launch a business. But lack of credit is surely also a factor. No doubt, lack of creditworthy balance sheets has precluded lending in many instances. At the same time, I would note that everywhere I travel, small businessmen and women complain about how hard it is to secure credit to fund expansion. Again and again, I hear that if today's lending environment had been the norm when they were starting out, their firm never would have made it. I'm not suggesting that big is always bad. A case can be made that economies of scale are needed, for example, in extractive industries, in order to support certain sizable investments. In a case close to home, remember that British Petroleum justified its acquisition of Sohio as sound because BP had Alaskan crude and Sohio had a robust marketing and distribution infrastructure. Perhaps you agree that the combination made sense and are happy it took place. Still, banks are different. They are the lifeblood of our economy. I am hard-pressed to understand how economies of scale lead to sounder lending. Regional and local banks have always fostered growth in local businesses, making lending decisions based on a number of factors, some quantifiable and some not. That is because banks deal with people, not commodities. If those calling the shots live on Park Avenue, far removed from everyday life, and are dealing only with the quants, doesn't that inevitably minimize human considerations, which in fact drive innovation and productivity? Looked at on the basis of value per dollar of assets, are the megabanks failing to carry their weight in the growth and expansion of the economy compared with their community bank brethren, because our largest financial institutions are more focused on capital markets and non-traditional banking services than lending? Another strip of data reinforces the point that we should be worried about small and mid-sized businesses, the traditional sources of innovation and job creation. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, business establishments with fewer than 1,000 employees constituted 64.4% of the private sector workforce in 1993, but have steadily declined to 60.8% in 2014. In other words, big business is getting bigger. One must wonder whether we are drifting towards confirmation of that old adage that banks lend only to those who don't need the money. If so, are the problems of stagnant wages and a low rate of labor participation, in part the product of overconcentration in the banking sector and its impact on small and mid-sized businesses. There's at least one additional dynamic to consider: the role of private enterprise in building communities. Two friends of over 40 years are here in the audience today, Jeff Weiss and Scott Keller. They have each built businesses here over the course of decades. Sometimes they took a ribbing for sticking with Cleveland from those of us in places like New York and D.C., but they never left. By the way, I am glad that LeBron came back. Yeah, that's right. I know from years of shared stories of Jeff and Scott's devotion to this community and their desire to see it prosper. When living in Indianapolis from 2009 through 2014, community leaders frequently bemoaned how much more difficult it had become to secure business participation in worthy civic projects, given the smaller number of corporate headquarters in the city compared to years ago. We can't have banks breaking the law, and we should all be concerned about low levels of business creation or a relatively smaller weighting of small and mid-sized entities in the private sector. We need to take a hard look at our largest financial institutions. Ensuring a sound, stable financial system which works for the American people ought to be every much a part of the Republican agenda as limited government, protection of individual liberty, and maintenance of a strong national defense. I seem to be the only announced or likely candidate raising the issue. Others won't go near this subject because they collect too much money from Wall Street. Understanding that the private sector is the engine of growth does not relieve Republicans of the obligation to regulate in a balanced, sensible manner or combat corporate cronyism and, to quote Janet Yellen once more, brazen illegality. In closing, let me address the question of viability. I do not think Wall Street and the big donors can buy this election. The voters will decide, and issues matter. I was in Iowa last week, where voters still reach their own judgments about issues and take their traditional role of surfacing talent and winnowing the presidential field pretty seriously. In one of our stops, I met with the GOP party chair of a county with a population of almost 30,000. She was encouraging and gave me some tips. One was shed the suit and get some jeans. Earlier in the week, she had received a call from one of the larger candidates. Pardon me, I meant to say larger campaigns. The operatives proposed an event this month with a ticket price of $250. She laughed and told us she had explained that candidates go to Iowa to test their ideas and meet the voters, not to raise money. I am raising a series of issues that won't wait for a time the politicians find convenient. I think they will resonate, and my campaign will do just fine. Before I take your questions, just let me say that if I do not get back to the City Club for a fourth time before then, please catch my acceptance speech in Cleveland at the 2016 Republican Convention. Thank you.
We're certainly looking forward to the 2016 Republican Convention, and we do hope to see you there in whatever capacity that happens.
I'm taking that as an endorsement.
We do not endorse candidates at the City Club of Cleveland. Today at the City Club, we're enjoying a Friday forum featuring Mark Everson, a candidate for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination. We encourage you to formulate your questions for our speaker now and ask that your questions be brief and to the point. And of course, in fact, questions as well. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many other radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Be sure to join us next Friday, April 10th, for a panel conversation with local community foundation and philanthropic leaders on the evolution and future of community foundations, now entering their second century of service. For more information about any of our upcoming programs or any of our past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Today's forum is sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Media Group, the City Club's sponsor of all politics and policy programming. We thank you very much for your support. And our community partner for today's program is the Fredonia Group. Thank you very much for your support. And now it's time to return to our speaker for the traditional City Club Q&A. If you're listening live on WCPN and would like to tweet your questions in, please tweet them at the City Club and use the hashtag CityClub. And we welcome questions from everyone, whether or not you're on Twitter or whether or not you're a member of the City Club. Guests are invited to ask questions as well. Holding our microphone today is our volunteer, Spencer Kiesel. Our first question, please.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us at the City Club today. Given our discussion of, big banks in the most recent financial crisis, I'm curious as to your thoughts on the effectiveness of Dodd-Frank and what additional reforms or different reforms you would propose.
I do think we need to take a good look at Dodd-Frank. I've talked to any number of bankers, particularly smaller bankers, and I think that some of this can be quite burdensome. And I think that the way it's been implemented by the government can be of concern as well. So I think it needs a top-to-bottom review. I agree with the Republicans who suggest that the self-funding mechanism is not a positive facet of it. I think it should be the funds for the agency that oversees a lot of the consumer protections should be appropriated by the Congress, which is traditional, rather than having this quasi-free-floating entity out there. So yes, I think it needs a good hard look, and particularly as to the implications on the smaller guys as well. On the other hand, it's interesting to me. I do think I've talked to, of course, former colleagues. Remember, the IRS is a part of the Treasury Department, the largest part, in fact. And I've talked to different colleagues who served in the Bush administration. They are concerned, many. About the larger banks and what we need to do about them. So yes, we need to look at this.
Mr. Everson, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I was going to ask you about Dodd-Frank, but since that got asked, I'll take another part of your experience, the Internal Revenue Service. We've heard a little more about them in a political sense of late, and the use of 501c4s. I don't know if you have a view on that. But I'd like to ask you more generally for your views on campaign finance, campaign reform, and reportable and unreportable and limited or unlimited donation.
First, the IRS. The IRS is stuck in a difficult place. What happened with the C4s and the political targeting was dead wrong, and it was handled really very poorly by the agency itself, even up to and including the problems with the lost emails and a failure to disclose that on a timely basis. And this has, to a very great degree, hardened attitudes against the tax agency. And that's unfortunate because we need, Ted Cruz has said he can abolish the IRS. That's just happy talk. I don't know where he thinks he's going to get the money, maybe from Goldman Sachs, where his wife works, I don't know. But they've got a lot of money, but they don't have it all yet. But it's been damaged. The tax agency's been damaged. And that's one reason that I really articulate this proposal to go with the hybrid system of the consumption tax, where you can get 150 million people off the tax rolls and just leave the IRS worrying about the big businesses and the high-income earners. I think we need to do something that have a real rupture, if you will, and get us to a better system, and also something where the tax administrator will be more respected. The second piece of your question, obviously, I'm running in part because I'm very concerned about all this money that's floating around. One of the candidates said, please don't give me more than $1 million. That was all widely reported. You've got the problems on the Democratic side with the money. I wrote a piece that was on the Clinton emails. I was very concerned about the Clinton emails because you have all the money that has washed through the foundation, and you have all the issue of the funding for years of both Clintons, if you will, in their electoral campaigns. And the question is, with the emails, it wasn't, the case was made somehow this implicated, the worry was about correspondence between the State Department employees and the Secretary. That's ridiculous. The question is, what were the communications between the Secretary and the big banks? Did the big banks say, we want a reset with Russia? We all know that's been a disaster, but did they want that because they thought they'd do more business? Or was the lead from behind strategy advocated by the oil companies so they could get back into the Middle East? We'll never know because we don't have those emails. I would like to have more transparency. I'd like to know where the money comes from when it comes someplace, but I'm not afraid of the money. Let me say that. I am doing this because I believe, again, as I said at the end of my remarks, the voters will decide. I think the people in places like Iowa and New Hampshire are offended by all the money. I think that it's been a blunder to go out and raise tens of millions of dollars, and it will ultimately turn, because it turns the stomach of so many people.
Mr. Everson, what are your thoughts on the current nuclear treaty that's being negotiated by the United States and other G8 members with Iran?
First, I think that from the get-go, even before the president was elected, he expressed a very strong desire to treat equally all countries, to deal openly with them, to meet with them without preconditions, to treat others maybe with a bad track record as worthy of engagement with the United States. He ran on that. He took criticism, you might remember, from Senator Clinton at the time. And certainly our relationships with our allies, most notably Israel, have deteriorated, and badly, badly. I stand for working with our allies and recognizing that that is the cornerstone to keeping the world safe. We can't go it alone, but we can't lead from behind. When you turn to Iran, Iran has not walked back and repudiated the desire to destroy Israel. So it baffles me why we would enter into a treaty or an obligation with them, which in a few short years, this has just been, I guess, released in the last few hours, in a few short years would free them to potentially produce nuclear weapons. And if you read the accounts in today's papers, the change in the strategy from precluding development of nuclear weapons and dismantling the infrastructure, we gave up on that a long time ago just so that we could control the period which they could change from capable to having a nuclear weapon. It leaves many people concerned because Iran remains what is called a threshold nuclear state. I just think that's got to be very alarming. And now look at what's happening. The Saudis and others are trying to counter the increasing influence of the Iranians. We've started things that have, I think, contributed to an unraveling of the situation over in that part of the world and made it very concerning. Let me clarify, though. I think the president, he clearly has to lead us in our foreign policy. I believe that the Senate has an important role here in terms of weighing in if it's a de facto treaty. I don't like the idea that this tension between the branches and this overreach by the White House, but I also don't like an overreach by the Congress, and so I'm not for the letter that was sent directly to our adversaries, or to our adversary by the 47 senators.
Mr. Everson. Many experts and economists have criticized the NAFTA agreement of limiting the increase in wages and standard of living of the middle class of this country. Would you comment on the potential Asian agreement that seems to be negotiated under secrecy at this present time?
I think that as a general situation, if you look back at recent decades, I remember working in the Reagan administration. I was in Tokyo with my boss Charlie Wick, and we sat at the table with Ambassador Mansfield and the leaders of all the big Japanese companies, and they were cleaning our clocks then. There was grave concern about our ability to compete because the Japanese were doing so much in the way of autos. I would suggest to you that free trade and that competition are in fact healthy, even though they do provide disruptions and great pain at times. Look at what we've done. We've gone through obviously a difficult transition with our automotive and other industries, but in many ways, our innovation, thanks to things like the R&D credit, which came in during that period of time, we are still doing well. Now, on wages, it's true, there's stagnant wages. You can see with Walmart, and then yesterday or this week, McDonald's in their company-owned stores, 1,500 stores around the country, they're going to actually bring up the wages a little bit. So I'm hopeful that we're starting to see some actions in the private sector that are going to help out those who are struggling and need more. But I am not against the free trade agreements. Your point, though, about transparency, I do not like the way we are running the executive branch with all the czars who take control of the power from the appointed and Senate-confirmed leaders of departments. That's wrong. I would really restructure things to provide traditional roles for those folks, but I would work closely with the Congress. And your senator and the old trade representative, Rob Portman, I'm sure he has views on this, but I don't think we were that secretive when we were in. So I don't like the lack of transparency. It's not healthy.
Hi, Mark. Two questions. Based on living in Indiana, can you comment on what the governor has been up to? And also, at what level do you hold board of directors responsible at these larger banks for not firing the chairmen or CEOs?
Let me sort of flip the order on these. I think the boards have been remiss in not making sure that there are stronger controls in place. Just this week, there was a deferred prosecution you may have noticed on HSBC. There was a release in the last 2 days talking about foot dragging on the part of the bank to change its culture. If the board isn't sending the message into the management and occasionally making a change where warranted, and I obviously cited the Chase example, that's a problem. Because the shareholders should do well, but all institutions, because think about it, they receive favorable treatment in the sense of the incorporation, the shield from liability. There are certain decisions that have been made in the construct of the law. They should be operating in a way that's consistent with the good of the country as well. So I think the boards need to do more. The question on this. I think that faith and tolerance are two sides of the same coin. And today's Good Friday. For me, the lesson of the gospel is one of strong faith, but also tolerance and acceptance and forgiveness. And you see it again and again in stories like that of the Good Samaritan or the woman at the well. I think that that one of the continuing and most serious challenges that we face as the United States and in the West is this confrontation with extremism, radical Islam, and a very disturbing rise in anti-Semitism that is taking place around the world. So we need to be extremely careful about how we deal with this challenge. We need to promote faith, but we also need to be clear that we stand against discrimination. I understand, I gather in the last 24 hours that the General Assembly has made changes that sound appropriate to sort of bring this chapter to a close. And look, I did my best for almost 4 years to try and take jobs from Ohio and bring them to Indiana when I was working for Mitch Daniels. I hope that now the situation in Indiana will settle down and it will continue to do well.
Your background is wonderfully diverse. I congratulate you on having so many perspectives to bring to bear.
It wasn't intentional, it just sort of happened.
That's widely experienced. And I like that it correlates with your enthusiasm for a diverse America. Your comment about immigration leads me to draw on the portion of your resume that touches on the INS. And I, for one, have been puzzled for years as to why it's been so difficult to build a consensus on how we address our immigration conundrum. And I frame it as exactly the juxtaposition of the two things you mentioned. The 11 million people who are here without the right papers aren't really all going to go home. And the other point is, why not make it impossible to get employed unless you're legal? And yet, how do you put those two together? How do we recognize that it's hard to seal a border, but it's not that hard to require good papers to be employed? Is there some explanation you might have to how we put all these pieces together and come up with a consensus on how to handle immigration?
I do think you can do this, and I think that you need, first, we haven't talked about changing the legal system. We need to change the legal system so that we can do things like get the benefit of those folks who are overseas who are making goods that are being exported here. So you change the legal system. It'll come at the expense, in part, of family unification. Now, the ability to bring in adult siblings or parents or stuff. But I'm very comfortable with that. We should be taking decisions about allowing the folks who've been educated here in the Midwest to stay if they've made a contribution. I met some fellow last night. He was here from China and working on a temporary visa with a local law firm. He struck me as someone who could be a real contributor over the long term to the country. So I think we need to be changing the legal system first, or in the same. By the way, I do all these things at the same time so that you get a compromise that satisfies different parties. But I would do that. I would work on controlling the border, but I would also, the electronic verification. The reason the '86 Act, which I oversaw the implementation, failed is that, and I helped at my kitchen table helped design the I-9 that you've all used if you've gotten some job. But it's that an prospective employee can come in and just show documents that would appear to be legitimate, but in fact they're not. It's not Mark Everson. It's really Jeff Weiss. I've got Mark Everson's papers. So if we have that database and people are checking with that database, you're going to verify the identity. I think that will do it in terms of sort of curtailing or limiting the magnet effect of people coming for jobs, because they won't be as readily able to get the jobs. If you do that, you control the border at the same time, then you've got this remaining question of what do you do about the large number of people who are here illegally. I do think you provide the amnesty, as I've indicated. I think that, again, We need to have that, reinforce that tradition of assimilation. I would have them learn English more promptly than was put in the Senate bill, which dealt with this a couple years ago. And I wouldn't be as generous, frankly, to the agricultural workers. That bill provided a path to citizenship. I would not provide a path to citizenship for the agricultural workers. They much more typically are coming here for a short period of time and sending money back to wherever they live. That's what their real goal is. So why should we confer that cherished benefit of citizenship when they really are just here temporarily? But if we don't do this, again, the stakes we have are, we used to have communities. Maybe there was the well-to-do lived on one side of the tracks and those with less money lived on the other side, but it was one community. We are sort of, what Lincoln called our bonds of affection are fraying. And we need to pull it all back together and head in the same direction. So yes, if we need to do that, that's a very different model. I've lived in Turkey, which has moved from a secular nation to one that is increasingly Islamic. And I've lived in France, which has the largest Islamic population, relatively speaking, in Europe. And they are struggling because their culture doesn't provide for assimilation. We need to get back to that.
Thank you very much, Mark. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a Friday forum featuring Mark Everson. He is a candidate for the Republican nomination for president. Thank you very much, Mr. Everson. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our forum is now adjourned.